Yeah, everybody loves you. They're really sad about what's happened, but they love you and they know that Jesus loves you
Hmm.
and that he is, hopefully that this, you know, hopefully we'll see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Hey guys, I want to take a moment and really go through everything that's been coming out because this situation has shifted in a way that's a lot more serious than it first appeared, and there are multiple layers to it that are only now starting to come into focus. At the beginning, it didn't seem like something that would escalate to this level. It looked like one of those stories that briefly circulates, gets talked about for a bit, and then fades away. But the more details that have surfaced, the clearer it's becoming that this is not a small or isolated issue. It's something that involves legal risks, family breakdown, and very real concerns about safety.
Say that again, sorry.
I mean, I'm just trusting that God is going to be, trying to trust that God's in control.
Yes, I know.
That's what I'm trying to do.
I know. I read about all these kings that, the ones that trusted God and the ones that didn't, and you just see like a huge difference. And I can definitely see how, where our view of God has been tainted by the people around us.
Yeah.
And not that it's an excuse for not being close to God, but it
Right.
definitely distorts our view of Him.
Yes.
And so I think that it's been really just too.
Well, hopefully we'll have a better view of God through all of this.
I think we will if we.
We're getting on a good track there.
Yeah, for sure.
What's now being revealed is that Joseph and Kendra Duggar could potentially be facing a civil case connected to allegations involving a minor. And this information didn't just come from rumors or speculation, it was shared publicly through a fundraiser created by the minor's family themselves. That detail matters because when a family steps forward in that way, explaining their situation and asking for help, it usually means they are dealing with something urgent and overwhelming. In this case, they specifically mentioned needing support not only for legal fees, but also to secure safe housing, which immediately raises questions about what their current living situation looks like and why they feel unsafe where they are. And when you look deeper into that part of the story, it becomes even more concerning. The family is reportedly living in a home that is directly tied to Joseph and Kendra, which creates a situation where the person at the center of the allegations still has a connection to their living environment. That's not just uncomfortable, it puts them in a position where they may feel like they don't have full control over their own safety. In situations involving minors, especially when there are serious allegations, one of the first priorities is usually to create distance and eliminate any possibility of contact. But here, that separation doesn't seem to fully exist yet, and that's a major reason why they are trying to move as quickly as possible. At the same time, this situation didn't just appear out of nowhere. There's a long history between these families that adds important context to everything that's happening now. Tensions had reportedly been building for years, particularly between Kendra's father, Paul, and members of the Duggar family. Those tensions weren't minor disagreements, they involved deeper conflicts around authority, belief systems, and control within their shared religious environment. Over time, those disagreements escalated to the point where they affected not just relationships, but also practical aspects of life, including work, housing, and community standing. One of the central issues in that conflict was a difference in how religion was being practiced and taught. Paul is described as someone who follows an independent fundamental Baptist approach, focusing primarily on direct biblical teachings, while there were efforts from the Duggar side to incorporate structured materials and teachings associated with the IBLP. That difference might sound technical on the surface, but in practice, it created a divide that impacted how decisions were made, how families were guided, and how authority was exercised within their community. Over time, that divide appears to have grown into a much larger fracture that changed the relationship between the families entirely.
As all of this was unfolding in the background, the current situation seems to have reached a breaking point when the minor involved began to understand and speak about what had happened. According to the information shared, this realization didn't happen in isolation. It came after broader awareness around similar cases, which helped connect certain experiences and bring them into focus. Once that connection was made, it led to a confrontation, and from there, everything appears to have moved very quickly. Decisions about leaving the home, seeking legal action, and prioritizing safety all started happening at the same time, which is why things now feel so urgent and intense. What makes this even more complex is that there are also financial and property-related factors involved. The housing arrangement between the families has changed over time, with ownership and control of the property shifting in ways that have now become highly relevant. When legal issues intersect with shared property and financial ties, it adds another layer of difficulty, because separating from that situation isn't as simple as just deciding to leave. It requires resources, planning, and often legal support. All of these elements together, legal concerns, safety risks, family conflict, and financial complications, are what make this situation so serious. It's not just one issue on its own, but a combination of factors that are all unfolding at once, and each one is affecting the others. When you step back and look at the full picture, it becomes clear that what started as something that might have seemed limited in scope has now turned into a situation with significant consequences for everyone involved. As this situation continues to unfold, what becomes more apparent is how many different factors were already in motion long before any of this became public. The current legal concerns didn't emerge in isolation. They're tied to a much larger pattern of tension, control, and decisions that had been building quietly over time. When you start tracing those connections, it helps explain why everything escalated so quickly once the initial confrontation happened. One of the key elements here is the timeline leading up to the present moment. Before any of these allegations came forward publicly, there were already signs that something was shifting within the family dynamic. Conversations had taken place about moving, about reorganizing living arrangements, and even about how certain properties and assets were being handled. At the time, those decisions might not have seemed unusual on their own, but now, looking back, they take on a very different meaning. There are reports that discussions were happening about transferring property, restructuring ownership, and even placing assets under different names. When viewed in the current context, those actions raise questions of intent, whether these were simply financial decisions or whether there was an awareness that legal complications could be on the horizon. In situations involving potential civil liability, asset protection becomes a very real consideration, and the timing of those conversations is something that stands out. At the same time, the relationship between the families was continuing to deteriorate. What had once been a close connection, shared beliefs, shared community, and even shared resources, had already begun to fracture years earlier. The disagreements between Paul and the Duggar family weren't just personal, they extended into leadership, authority, and the direction of their religious practices. That kind of divide doesn't resolve easily, and in this case, it appears to have created an environment where trust had already been significantly weakened before the current situation even began.
Another important piece of this is how information was handled within that environment. There are claims that not everything was fully disclosed or communicated clearly, particularly when it came to serious matters affecting the family. When transparency is limited, it can lead to misunderstandings at best, and at worst, it can prevent people from recognizing risks or taking action sooner. In this case, that lack of clarity may have played a role in how long it took for certain concerns to fully come to light. When the minor involved began to connect their experience to what had happened, it marked a turning point that couldn't be ignored. What's especially significant is that this realization didn't happen in a vacuum. It was influenced by increased awareness of similar cases and discussions happening more openly. That kind of awareness can be powerful, especially for someone who may not have previously had the context or language to understand what they experienced. Once that connection was made, the situation moved from being unspoken to something that required immediate action. That action came in the form of confrontation, and from there, everything began to accelerate. The father stepping in, addressing what had been revealed, and pushing forward with next steps changed the trajectory entirely. What had once been contained within the family dynamic was now moving into legal territory, and that shift brought a completely different level of seriousness to the situation. At the same time, the urgency around housing became impossible to ignore. Living in a property connected to the accused created a constant risk, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically as well. In cases like this, even the possibility of access or proximity can be enough to create fear, and that's why securing a separate, safe living environment became such a priority for the family. It's not just about relocation, it's about creating a sense of stability and protection during a time when everything else feels uncertain. There's also the broader concern of potential retaliation, which is something that often comes up in situations involving close-knit communities or influential families. When there are power dynamics involved, whether financial, social, or reputational, it can create additional pressure on those who come forward. The fear isn't just about the immediate situation, but what might follow. Loss of support, public backlash, or even direct attempts to discredit or intimidate. All of this contributes to why the family is not only seeking legal representation, but also emphasizing safety so strongly in their public statements. They're not just preparing for a court process, they're trying to navigate a situation where multiple risks exist at the same time and where each decision carries significant consequences. When you put all of these pieces together, it becomes clear that this is no longer just about a single allegation or a single moment. It's about a chain of events, some recent, some years in the making, that have now collided in a way that's forcing everything into the open. As things move further into legal territory, the focus starts to shift from what happened to what can actually be done about it. And that's where the situation becomes even more complex, because in cases like this, there isn't just one path forward. There are multiple legal routes, each with its own requirements, timelines, and challenges, especially when a minor is involved. One of the immediate steps that typically comes into play is some form of legal protection, and based on what's been shared, that's likely one of the first priorities for the family right now. When there are safety concerns, families often seek protective orders that legally prevent any form of contact, whether that's in person, through communication, or even indirect interaction. But while that might sound straightforward, it's not always simple in practice, especially when the other side has access to significant financial resources and legal support. That alone can make the process more difficult, more time-consuming, and more emotionally draining for the people trying to secure that protection. At the same time, there's the question of a civil case, which operates very differently from a criminal proceeding. A criminal case focuses on whether a law was broken and what penalties should follow, but a civil case is about accountability in a broader sense, covering damages that go beyond immediate costs. This can include things like long-term therapy, emotional distress, and the overall impact on a person's life, which in situations involving minors can be significant and long-lasting. That's part of why families in these situations often pursue both avenues, because one doesn't fully address everything on its own. What makes this even more challenging is the timing. When a case is still developing, many of the resources that people assume are immediately available actually depend on certain legal outcomes. For example, some forms of support or compensation may only become accessible after a conviction, which means that in the early stages, families are often navigating everything on their own, covering legal costs, relocation, and emotional support without much external assistance. That gap between the start of a case and any formal resolution is where a lot of the pressure builds. And then there's the financial side of it, which can't be ignored. Legal proceedings, especially ones that involve multiple filings like protective orders and potential civil claims, can become extremely expensive. When you combine that with the need to move, secure new housing, and possibly distance yourself from an entire community, the financial burden increases quickly. That helps explain why the family chose to go public with their request for support. It's not just about legal representation, it's about creating the ability to actually follow through with the steps needed to protect themselves. Another layer to all of this is the structure of accountability itself. In certain cases, it's not only the individual accused who can face legal consequences, but also other parties, depending on the circumstances, especially if there were environments or systems that may have contributed to what happened. That possibility expands the scope of what a civil case might involve and can make the process even more complex as it brings in additional factors that need to be examined and proven.
Meanwhile, decisions that were made earlier, like discussions around property ownership and asset distribution, start to take on more significance. In legal disputes, especially those involving potential financial damages, the way assets are structured can become a major point of focus. If properties or businesses are moved or reassigned, it can raise questions about whether those actions were routine or whether they were done in anticipation of legal risk. Even if there are explanations, the timing alone often invites scrutiny. Beyond the legal and financial aspects, there's also the emotional reality that doesn't always get as much attention, but is just as important. Situations like this don't just affect one person, they impact entire families. Relationships shift, trust is broken, and people are forced to make decisions under pressure that can change the course of their lives. For the minor at the center of this, the focus is on safety and healing, but for the family as a whole, it's about navigating a situation that touches every part of their daily life. And as all of this unfolds, there's an added layer of public attention that can complicate things even further. Once a situation becomes widely discussed, it brings in outside opinions, assumptions, and sometimes misinformation. That kind of environment can make it harder for the people directly involved to move forward quietly or privately, and it can also increase the pressure they feel as they go through an already difficult process. When you step back and look at everything together, the legal steps, the financial strain, the emotional impact, and the broader environment, it becomes clear that this is not something that will resolve quickly or easily. It's a situation that's still developing, with multiple paths ahead, and each one comes with its own set of challenges that the family now has to face in real time. As everything continues to unfold, what really stands out is how this situation is no longer confined to just legal filings or private disputes. It has grown into something that affects reputation, influence, and the way entire communities respond. When a case involves a well-known family with deep connections, the impact tends to reach far beyond the individuals directly involved, and that's exactly what seems to be happening here. There are growing concerns not just about the case itself, but about how support is being distributed behind the scenes. According to what's been shared, there's a strong belief from the minor's family that the backing within the larger circle is not going toward the victim, but instead toward protecting Joseph and Kendra. Whether or not every detail of that perception can be independently verified, the fact that it's being expressed publicly shows how fractured the situation has become. Trust, which was already strained, now appears to be almost completely broken. At the same time, this has brought renewed attention to the power dynamics that exist within tightly connected groups, especially those built around shared belief systems and long-standing authority figures. When leadership, finances, and influence are concentrated in a small circle, it can create an environment where decisions aren't just personal, they're strategic. And in moments like this, those dynamics become more visible, particularly in how quickly narratives form and how strongly different sides defend their positions. Another important detail that adds context is the contrast in how different belief systems within the same broader religious space are being described. On one side, there's an approach that is more strictly rooted in direct biblical interpretation, while on the other, there's a structure that systems. That difference might seem subtle from the outside, but within these communities, it can shape everything, from how families operate to how conflicts are handled. In this case, it appears to have played a role in how decisions were made when the situation first came to light. What's also being highlighted is how the response to a situation like this can reveal underlying priorities. In some cases, families or communities may choose to handle issues internally, focusing on containment and reputation. In others, there's a push toward involving external systems like law enforcement and the courts. Here, the decision to go to authorities, despite the potential consequences, suggests that for the minor's family, protection and accountability took precedence over maintaining relationships or avoiding conflict. That decision, however, doesn't come without consequences. Moving forward legally can sometimes mean facing resistance, not just in court, but socially and financially as well. There's always the risk of being challenged, questioned, or even isolated, especially when the other side has more resources or influence. That's part of why the emphasis on safety keeps coming up, because the concern isn't limited to the case itself, it extends to everything that surrounds it. There's also the reality that situations like this can reshape how people see individuals and institutions they once trusted. When new information comes to light, it forces a reassessment, not just of what happened, but how it was handled, who knew what, and what actions were taken or not taken. That process doesn't happen instantly, but over time, it can change public perception in a significant way. At the center of all of this, though, is still the core issue that started it: the need to ensure safety, accountability, and a path forward for the minor involved. Everything else, from the legal strategies to the public discussions, ultimately connects back to that. And while there are still many unanswered questions and ongoing developments, what's already clear is that this situation has reached a point where it can't simply be minimized or ignored. When you look at the full picture from beginning to end, it becomes clear that this is not just a single event, but a chain reaction. Years of tension, decisions made behind the scenes, and a moment of realization that brought everything into the open at once. And now, with legal processes beginning, relationships fractured, and public attention growing, this is a situation that will likely continue to evolve, with each step forward revealing even more about what's really been happening beneath the surface.